Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Wendy Chamberlain and would like to welcome you to the Middle East Institute. You know, it's my great pleasure today to be able to welcome a dear friend, but also a scholar who's highly respected throughout Washington. Ken Pollack is joining us today to talk about one of the hottest issues in Washington today, Iran and the nuclear issues. And he's doing it in the context of his new book, Unthinkable, Iran, the Bomb, and American Strategy. He has agreed to stay after his talk today and sign the books. If you'd care to purchase one of them, they'll be on sale. They cost $25, and I think it's a sensational book. Ken's book was written before the election of Hassan Rouhani as the new president of Iran, and that has brought new opportunities and possibilities and complications as we relate to Iran with our nuclear threat and our sanctions, and I'm sure he's going to want to talk about that this afternoon. A lot of questions are going to come up. How does Rouhani's election change our policy with regards to nuclear nonproliferation in Iran and the sanctions? How is the latest rapprochement between Presidents Rouhani and President Obama going to affect our policies as we move in the future? And Ken's book is particularly timely and important now because he addresses a topic that is somewhat controversial in some circles, and that is containment. Ken needs little introduction around town. He's a senior fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy, the Brookings Institution. Ken has been writing on Iran and Iraq and the Middle East for years. He began his career as a Persian Gulf analyst at the CIA, and he's been twice on the staff at the National Security Council, including as director for Persian Gulf Affairs. He's the author of 7 books on the political, military, and economic affairs in the Middle East, including The Threatening Storm and The Persian Puzzle. Before we begin, if I could just take a couple of minutes to alert you all to some exciting events that are coming up in the Middle East Institute. On November 14, we'll be hosting our annual banquet, which is going to be exceptional this year because we're honoring 2 extraordinary Arabs. Zaha Hadid is the architect. She's the winner of the very coveted architectural, it's like the Nobel Prize for Architecture, the Pritzker Prize. She's got amazing projects that she's working on now, including the Olympic Stadium in Japan and the soccer stadium in Doha. She's amazing. She'll be joined. We'll also be awarding Kuwaiti humanitarian Abdulatif Al-Hamad, who is the director of the Arab Fund for Social and Economic Development. The next day is our annual conference. I know many of you, I see recognized faces in the audience today that do always attend our conference. It's going to be, action-packed as it always is, but the luncheon, let me draw your attention to the luncheon because this is very special too. We have invited the 2 co-founders of Breaking the Impasse. This is an organization of Palestinian and Israeli business leaders who have come together to push for and publicize the need and the necessity for reaching a resolution to that conflict. Munib Mashri and Yosef Vardi. So please sign up. You can always go online and do that. And now I welcome Ken. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Wendy, for that very kind introduction. And just thank you for having me back at MEI. It's always so great to be here. In this audience, I'm going to give a somewhat different talk. I've been out on the hustings all over the country talking about the book and talking about Iran, but this is obviously a much more knowledgeable expert audience, and that's great because it allows us to dig into some of these topics in greater depth. As Wendy pointed out, the secret of my success is just good timing. Thankfully, the Iranians accommodated me and elected President Rouhani, and we have this remarkable new opportunity right now. And in the midst of it, I come out with a book related to the topic. And I thought I would start with Rouhani, and I'm glad to talk more about my perception of what's going on in the Q&A if you'd like to. But I will start by saying that one of the points that I make right up front and then kind of carry it through all through the book is the importance of a negotiated settlement with Iran and how much better for everyone it would be if we could deal with Iran's nuclear program and actually with the wider issues that we have with Iran through a negotiated settlement. The more that you look at the different options, the more that you keep coming back to the point that a diplomatic settlement is so much better, infinitely better, than any other option that the United States or our allies have when it comes to Iran. I will also say that I think that Rouhani is undoubtedly the best, and it may well be the last opportunity that we have to get this kind of a deal with Iran. Because it's the best, I hope that we're able to actually bring it to fruition, and I hope that we are able to take advantage of this opportunity. But I also fear that because Rouhani is so willing to go so far, much farther than we've seen the Iranians go in the past, because he does seem to have some freedom of action from the supreme leader and some ability to stave off the rival hardliners. If he's not able to bring about a deal, if he's not able to secure Iran's interests through the negotiating table, I worry that it's basically going to sour the Iranians or simply empower the hardliners in Iran in a way that will be difficult to overcome in the future. That's not a reason to accept any deal that Iran puts on the table, but to my mind, it does reinforce our sense, what I think is our sense, that we need to take this opportunity very seriously. I will say that what I've seen from Rouhani so far has been quite remarkable, and I disagree with those who say that this has all been just talk and no action. As we all know in the Middle East, words are actions, and you pay a price for words. And I think that Rouhani has already been paying a price for many of the things that he has said. And the offer that he's already put on the table, or that Javad Zarif has already put on the table, has taken Iran several steps beyond anything that we've seen from them in the past. Now, whether they're ready to put the deal on the table that I think that we should accept, that I talk about at great length in the book, about where the meeting of the minds probably lies between the United States and our allies and Iran, that remains to be seen. Certainly, Zarif has hinted at it. I think that there are real reasons to believe that we will eventually get the Iranians to put something very much like that on the table. And if that's the case, I hope we can bring ourselves to accept it, because I do think this is a remarkable opportunity, one that I fear that we will not have again, or won't have again, at least for a very, very long time, and who knows what happens then. And as I said, I'm delighted to talk more about the current negotiations. In the Q&A, I said there's a very big chunk of this book that talks about both the importance of the negotiated settlement, why it is so much better than any other option that we have, and also, again, what it ought to look like, what we ought to be willing to give, what we ought to look for from the Iranians, what are the most important elements of that, how to take it beyond it. But of course, this book is about more than that, because when I wrote it thinking that the next big foreign policy crisis that the United States was going to have was likely to be about Iran. The nuclear issue was clearly coming to fruition even before Rouhani's election. And what really concerned me was a sense in the United States that increasingly what was going to happen was we were going to give the Iranians one last chance to come to the table, and if they weren't willing to accept what we wanted them to accept, we were going to go to war with them. And that had seemed to become the zeitgeist in the United States by the spring. And I felt that to be a very dangerous way to handle Iran, both because I wasn't convinced that war was necessary, but also because I was quite convinced that the American people hadn't thought this through and really hadn't thought through what could be involved. And of course, I think all of us recognize that the experience of the last 10 years has been that when we haven't thought through our military commitments, they've tended to get a little bit out of hand. And we've had to pay much bigger prices than we ever imagined, because we've gone into these wars in an expectation that we would get the best case. And of course, one of the wonderful things about history is that, consistently, the muse of history, whenever you expect the best case, seems to hand you the worst case. And so I wanted to at least put these things on the table. And the title of my book, Unthinkable, came from Herman Kahn's famous work from 1962 on nuclear war. Thinking the Unthinkable, where Kahn basically made the argument that, look, we may not want to think about nuclear war, but it may happen anyway. If it happens, we're going to wish we had thought about it. And not thinking about it is more likely to make it more likely that we will wind up in such a war. And for me, I was really struck by the fact that no one wanted to think about what our real alternatives were with Iran and what they would entail and which one was the better option. And I think that's particularly pertinent today for two reasons. First, as wonderful as this opportunity is, we, I think, need to be very realistic and say we may not get it. Okay? The Iranians are over here, we're over there. Even if we can get a meeting of the minds between the two presidents, I think we need to be very realistic that ultimately it's not only about the two presidents coming to an agreement, President Obama and President Rouhani. At the end of the day, it's also going to come down to the Ayatollahs, to Ayatollah Khamenei and Ayatollah Cruz and Rand Paul. They're going to have a say in this too. Okay? And we just don't know whether they're going to be willing to accept the deal that I think is the real deal. Okay? What we have seen is that both hardliners on both sides have reservations about this. And I think that we need to recognize that any deal that the United States and Iran can both sign up to is not going to be a perfect deal for either side. What I would argue is that it will be good enough for both sides. But of course, good enough is a relative term, and we don't know how the right on both sides is going to react to it. We've already seen the Israeli government coming in and saying, zero enrichment, absolutely zero enrichment, no equivocation on that point. Now, that may just be the Israelis playing bad cop. And if that's the case, that's fine. I have no problem with it. I talk a lot about the Israelis in this book, and one of the points that I make is that as frustrating and sometimes irritating as the constant Israeli carping has been, I think that we need to recognize that it has been Israel that got us to this point. That if it weren't for the Israelis constantly complaining, constantly threatening to go to war, the world would have forgotten about Iran long ago, and they'd probably have nuclear weapons by now. So Israel has played a very important role in this. And if all they're doing now is simply continuing to play that role, but they are willing ultimately to be flexible and to recognize that we shouldn't make perfect the enemy of good enough, that's fine. That's great, in fact. But of course, some of Prime Minister Netanyahu's rhetoric leads one to wonder whether that's actually the case. And perhaps he actually means it when he says zero enrichment and nothing else. And if that's the case, well, then it's going to be very hard to bring the Israelis on board, and that's obviously going to create reticence here in the United States as well. And of course, we, I think, are all well aware of the kind of opposition that President Rouhani faces back in Tehran, where it's very clear from the attacks in the press, by the fact that he was pelted with shoes and garbage when he came home, even if that was staged, and I'm sure it was staged, it speaks to the opposition there. Right? We've always known the problem is not with the Iranian people, most of whom I suspect would support this deal. Some small percentage, but nevertheless it may run into the millions, probably would oppose it. But the issue is always within the Iranian regime itself. It is the elite. And there is a segment of the Iranian elite, a very important segment, that does oppose this. And we don't know what influence they're ultimately going to have over things. And I think we do have a very strong sense that sitting at, as I describe in the book, the fulcrum point in this entire debate is the supreme leader. And the supreme leader is someone who is deeply, deeply suspicious, I will use that term, of the United States. He's also someone who, what we've seen over the years, has never been one to really be bold about taking kind of far-reaching decisions. As I say in the book, this is a very weak man in a very strong position. And he typically likes to make hard decisions by not making those decisions. And he'll come out with some Delphic pronouncement. Or in this crowd, I will say, One of my favorite stories about Khamenei's decision-making was a number of years ago. We had a couple of very highly regarded Iranian economists come to Brookings from Tehran to talk with us about the Iranian economy. And we spent an afternoon with them. And the moment in that conversation that I remember most well was a moment when one of the economists said, well, you know, and we think that this policy is going to continue because, of course, we know that the supreme leader is in favor of this policy. And those of us around the table, it was a small group of us, we immediately went, you know, wait a second. We stopped them, said, you just said something really interesting. You said that you know that the supreme leader backs this policy. And we said, you know, we don't know what that looks like. Could you explain to us what it looks like when the supreme leader says definitively, yes, this is the policy I back? And I'll never forget, this is one economist, and I'm going to leave his name out of things, but he said, you know, he kind of rolled his eyes, you know, you stupid Americans. And we're like, yes, we're stupid Americans. Please explain to us because we have no clue. He said, look, it's very simple. I've got a friend who works in the supreme leader's office. And he told me that the memo proposing this policy went into the Supreme Leader's office, and 2 weeks later, there was no answer. So we know that the Supreme Leader supports this policy. And you know, as you can imagine, all of us sitting around the table, all of them had worked in government before, like, oh my God, you know, the memo's sitting in the bottom of his inbox, he's never even looked at it, and these guys are off implementing as if he has, you know, said, go forth and do this. But yeah, this is what we see from Khamenei. And I always say that, you know, he seems to like to, when he has a really hard decision to make, you know, typically he gives half a loaf to the hardliners and half a loaf to the reformists and half a loaf to the conservatives and half a loaf to the people in Tehran and half a loaf to the people in Esfahan. And I know I've just given out, what, 7 halves of the same loaf? And I'm not suggesting that the supreme leader can't do math. I'm sure he can. It's just that, you know, he seems to do things in this way of kind of coming up with these kind of very ambiguous positions that seem to tell everyone that they're getting most of what they want, and then he just kind of lets them figure things out, which is why oftentimes we see policy in Iran seeming to be very disjointed, with different elements going off in different directions and a high degree of inertia. And so again, you know, when you look at this situation, you can say President Obama is going to have his hands full when he goes down to the Hill to try to sell, again, what almost certainly will not be a perfect deal, but will hopefully be good enough. But the same thing for Rouhani when he goes home. And it's almost certainly going to mean he not only has to convince the supreme leader that it's a good deal for Iran, but he's going to have to convince the supreme leader to accept a deal that is undoubtedly going to alienate, infuriate certain very important aspects of the Iranian government, elements that the supreme leader has always been very loath to infuriate in that way. So I don't think that it's a sure thing that we get this deal. I'm hopeful, but I don't think it's a sure thing. And if that's the case, and we can't get the deal, then we're going to have to think very hard about what we do instead. What's plan B? And the other reason that I think that this is very important is because whether or not you are willing to take the deal is, I think, ultimately very much predicated on how you answer that first question of what is plan B, what is your preferred plan B, what would you be willing to do if we couldn't get the deal? Because the truth is, if we can't get the deal with Iran, we really have just 2 options at this point in time. We have option A, which is we go to war with Iran, the military option. We use force to prevent the Iranians from bringing their nuclear program to fruition. And the alternative is that we contain Iran, as we have been for the past 34 years, conceivably even containing a nuclear Iran. Although, as I talk about in the book, I think there are lots of things that we could do even within a containment regime that would give us a pretty high likelihood of preventing the Iranians from weaponizing even under conditions of containment. But nevertheless, how you think about those things very much weighs on what you're going to decide about the deal. If you're ready to go to war with Iran, and in some cases I think there are some people who prefer to go to war with Iran, but I think most of the people out there who are advocating for the military option, and I will say right up front, I don't think those people are craven, I don't think that they are unpatriotic, I don't think they're stupid. And I think that there is actually a lot to recommend the military option, a lot more than when last I looked at the military option 10 years ago. But I think that for those people, they look at this and say, because we are ready to go to war, because I am willing to pay the costs and run the risks of going to war with Iran. I want a perfect deal. And why should I accept anything less than a perfect deal with Iran? Because I am willing to go to war with Iran if I don't get that perfect deal. And for those who are unwilling to pay that price, for those who would prefer to do containment, well, good enough looks a lot better. Okay? You don't want to lose that. And in fact, it pushes you in the opposite direction to say, well, look, if I'm willing to accept even the status quo, then almost anything I get from Iran is better than the status quo. And so answering that question is a critical element of how we respond to the offer that we're ultimately able to produce as a result of these negotiations. In that way, it reminds me very much of what we just went through with Syria, where I think that the American public actually responded very wisely. You know, the president tried to make the Syria crisis about this question of use of chemical warfare agents and how the U.S. should respond to it. And the American public's reaction was, in effect, no, we think that the debate is actually a much bigger one about whether or not the United States ought to be involved in the Syrian civil war at all, and if so, what should that involvement look like? And I thought that was very smart. I thought I gave the American public a tremendous amount of credit. But I think the same thing is true with Iran. When we see the deal, we can't simply have a narrow deal about whether this deal is good or bad or perfect or this. We've got to have this wider debate about if we're not willing to take the deal, what do we do instead? Because that ultimately, I think, will be determinative as to whether or not we're willing to take that deal. Now, there's a lot in this book about the military option. And by the way, I have a huge chapter on an Israeli military strike. For those interested, just to give you the punchline, that's the worst option of all. Okay? An Israeli military strike does not make any sense. Not for us, not for the Israelis, not for any of our allies. Glad to talk about that at great length in the Q&A for those who are interested. Where an American strike is concerned, again, I think that the case is a stronger one, but ultimately I come down on the side of containment. And I'm not going to spend too much time, but I just want to throw out some of the high points, some things for you folks to consider when you think about it. First, as I think many of you know, I'm an old military analyst, and I am not exactly a shrinking violet. Okay? I believe in the use of force. I believe that the use of force is a legitimate tool of American foreign policy. And I believe that there are times when we have been justified in employing force. But I also do believe that force truly should be our last resort, that we should only use it when we don't have any other alternatives. And I absolutely believe that we should only use force when the American public is behind it and fully understands the costs and risks involved in doing so. That using force is always about opening Pandora's box, and you never know what's going to come out. And sometimes our uses of force go extremely well, and sometimes they go extremely badly. And you can't commit yourself to force without being willing to accept both of those scenarios and everything that lies in between. And as I said, I don't think the American public has really thought through what the use of force against Iran would look like or could look like, what all the scenarios look like. But for me, when I think about the use of force, as I said, I think there is a better case for the use of force today than there was 10 years ago, in part because a lot of the alternatives that I was proposing 10 years ago have been tried. And some of them have been found wanting. The main policy that I proposed, well, that's what's come to fruition. And it may actually work out, and if that's so, that's great. But if it doesn't, then I think that we can say, yes, we really have exhausted most of the alternatives. The only one left out there is containment. But for me, I ultimately come down on the side of containment, both because I think containment is a perfectly plausible strategy and therefore we're not at the last resort, but also because I have some real concerns about the military option when it comes to Iran. And I'll just toss out three of them for you. First, I'm not sure we know where all the Iranian nuclear sites are. Now, to some extent, this is like Wendy, like Ambassador Wilcox, like some of the others in the audience, Jim Plack, once burned, twice shy. I remember our Iraq experience, especially in 1991, where the U.S. intelligence community was absolutely convinced it knew exactly where all the Iraqi nuclear sites were, and it turned out we did not have a clue. And there were 14 Iraqi nuclear sites that we didn't even know what they were. 6 of them were massive facilities that could have built bombs all by themselves. And we've certainly gotten better in the case of Iran, but the Iranians have demonstrated a real proclivity to build secret facilities. And we have found at least some of those facilities. Obviously, we don't know about the facilities we don't know about. Okay? But we know we found some of them. But in those cases, it's typically taken 2, 3, 4 years to find the ones that we actually did find. And I worry that maybe there are some other sites out there that they only started a year ago or 2 years ago and we haven't found yet. Or as I said, maybe there are some sites out there that have been secret for 10 years and we've never found them. And as I said, I think we've done a lot better at that, but I'm not yet ready to say, yes, absolutely, we know exactly what the Iranian nuclear program looks like, and therefore, if we started bombing, we would hit every single strike, every single site. Second concern. I don't think that the military option, as it's currently envisioned, which would be a series of airstrikes, conceivably one night, but probably more like 3, 5, 7, 10 days worth of airstrikes, I don't think it would be the end of the Iranian nuclear program. What I'm afraid of is that the day after our strikes end, the Iranians kind of dust themselves off, pick themselves up, wave their fist at the international community, and announce that they are withdrawing from the NPT, rebuilding their program, evicting the inspectors, and will deploy an actual nuclear arsenal. I'm afraid of that, first of all, because they keep saying that that's what they will do. You've got all these different Iranians who keep saying that's exactly what they would do. And I'm also concerned about it because that's been the pattern of other countries, and most notably Iraq. We should remember, 1981, the Osirak strike. In the popular mythology, the idea, what happened at Osirak was the Israelis bombed the Iraqi nuclear facility, and that set back Saddam Hussein enormously, so much so that when we invaded in 1991, he didn't have nuclear weapons. Well, you can say a lot of bad things about the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I would hardly support those bad things. A lot of bad things happened. But one good thing, at least, happened from 2003, which is we got access to all of Saddam's files. And of course, we also found out that Saddam shared at least one thing, perhaps more, with Richard Nixon, which is that he taped all of his conversations. So we actually know a lot about Iraq at this point in time. And the scholars who've gone back and looked at Osirak again in the full knowledge of what we found after 2003 have actually come to the exact reverse conclusion. And the consensus among the scholarly community who are now looking at Osirak is that in the net, Osirak did more to accelerate the Iraqi nuclear program than retard it. And the Iraqis were actually farther along because Saddam was so furious and so humiliated at being bombed that he poured resources into the program, and it was actually making far more progress after Osirak than it was before then. And we should also remember that in 1991, we bombed the Iraqis for 43 days. We flew 88,000 sorties against Iraq. I mean, this is infinitely bigger than anything we're talking about doing in Iran. And at the end of it, as I pointed out, Iraq still had most of its nuclear program intact, and Saddam didn't give it up. Okay? For the first several years, Saddam did everything he could to try to hold on to as much of it as he possibly could. Okay? He wasn't interested in giving it up. It wasn't the bombing that caused him to give up his program. Ultimately, it was the combination of the inspections and the sanctions that eventually, probably around 1996 or 97, convinced him he did have to give up the WMD, and in particular, the nuclear program. And I worry that if what I just suggested happens, and after the bombing stops, the Iranians announce that they are rebuilding and going for nuclear weapons, I don't think that President Obama or any American president is going to be able to go on TV and basically say, in effect, well, we gave it a shot, we tried it, but didn't work, now we're just going to have to live with them. Okay? That doesn't strike me as the way that we roll. If the president goes out there and makes the case that this is dangerous enough, this threat is grave enough to the American national security for us to bomb them for 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, and to risk American lives in the process, I don't think that we're going to be willing to just accept that, okay, we gave it one shot and that's over and done with. Okay. And the third thing that I'm worried about is what I've already just alluded to, which is that I think that there will be a cost in U.S. lives to this, and in particular, that the Iranians will retaliate. Now, A lot of people worry about Iranian missile forces and them closing down the Strait of Hormuz. I deal with those at great length in the book. I am not concerned about those. They may try some missile strikes, not a big deal. I don't think they will try to close the Strait of Hormuz in any circumstances short of a full-scale invasion. And again, I talk about that in great length in the book. But what I do worry about with the Iranians is terrorism. You know, we should always remember what Richard Armitage famously said after 9/11 when he went down to the Senate and he said, Al-Qaeda, they're the junior varsity of terrorism. The varsity, that's Hezbollah and Iran. Okay? These guys are very good at this stuff. You know, we saw with the Arbabsiar plot 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, they had allowed their intelligence assets, the terrorist assets in the United States to atrophy. Since then, what the intelligence community is finding is that they are doing everything that they can to rebuild those capabilities because they do get the fact that they have allowed those assets to atrophy. And again, they are warning us, threatening us, that if we bomb them, they're going to bomb us. Now, how much damage could they do? Nobody knows. We don't know exactly what their capabilities will end up being. And look, we have done a lot of work on improving our homeland defenses. But if the United States bombs Iran, I think the Iranians will try. And I think there's a pretty good likelihood that they will kill people here in the United States. And again, under those circumstances, I don't think that the President of the United States is going to be able to stand up on television and say, well, you know, what do you want? We started it. I suspect that there's going to be enormous pressure on him to retaliate, to respond, and to force the Iranians to desist. And what we've seen historically is that is very hard to do. And as one of several people in this room who have participated in crisis simulations and war games of a war between the US and Iran, both in government and out, my experience is that it's very hard to end those interactions. And I worry that we will find ourselves in the same situation with Iran that we did with Iraq. Well, let's remember, you know, we hit Saddam with cruise missiles 3 times in the 1990s. Then in 1998, we tried bombing him for 3 days, all to try to get him to desist from reconstructing his weapons of mass destruction program, which he was doing for part of that period of time and not doing for other parts of it. And our frustration with our inability to get him to fully comply was probably the most important reason for the invasion of Iraq, or at least the most important reason that 70% of the American public supported the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And my fear is that if we start down the military path with Iran, we'll wind up following that same course that we followed with Iraq. We will try limited operations. We will find it exceptionally frustrating. They won't do what we want them to do. They will strike back at us, and we will wind up responding and retaliating and eventually escalating. I compare that scenario to containment. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I really want to wrap this up so we can get into Q&A. I try to be very open-eyed about containment. I would never suggest that containment is easy or it's going to be fun, it's going to be cheap, it's not going to be a problem. I think containment sucks, honestly. I just think that it doesn't suck nearly as bad as the military option. Okay? I think there are real issues with containment. I think there are real problems. I think that the pieces that people like Matt Krenig and Eric Edelman and Andy Krepinevich and other people have written about the problems of containment, I think those are very valid considerations. And I try in the book to deal with each one of them in turn. But what I also found as I worked through this, and I'll be honest with you, I came to this and said, you know, I will put out any book that I come up with. Wherever my analysis takes me, I will run with that. But the more that I worked through that analysis, and the more that I looked at the history of Iran's behavior and our interactions with Iran, and also brought in the experiences of the US-Soviet dynamic and the US-Chinese dynamics and the Indian-Pakistani dynamics and all of the other nuclear dyads out there and all of the other instances of American containment strategies, the more that I came to the conclusion that while a number of problems absolutely did exist and posed real challenges for containment, none of them seemed to me to be insurmountable. In fact, many of them actually seem to be much less important and much less threatening than they seemed before I actually walked through the analysis and actually thought through what it would take to deal with these situations. I'm not going to raise every single problem that I talk about in the book, but I'll just throw out three that get raised on a regular basis when people talk about containing Iran and containing a nuclear Iran. The first of these is crisis management. Okay? If Iran's got nuclear weapons, we could find ourselves in some very prickly situations, some very tense moments with the Iranians. But two things really strike me about this. First, I see absolutely nothing out there to indicate that the Iranian regime is crazy, irrational, messianic, millenarian, or any of this stuff. I think that is nonsense. Okay? And I'm also struck by how many Israelis and how many Europeans and how many experts on Iran all conclude the same thing. When you look at Iranian behavior, the government's behavior is coldly rational. Okay? Second point, they also have enormous respect for American military power. I mean, what's really striking about the Iranians, and I'm not going to make them out to be nicer than they are. The Iranian regime is nasty, they're murderous, they're anti-American, they do all kinds of bad things. But they're not crazy, and they have a very clear sense of what we could do to them. And what we typically see is they try to go right up to our red line and then stop. And I talk a lot in the book about the few instances where they clearly did cross our red line. And what's so striking to me is not that they crossed the red line, but how they reacted once they realized they had done so. And that is to pull back very fast, because they immediately recognize, oh boy, didn't mean to do that. Now we're risking an American military strike, and we don't want that. Okay? And that's a very important sign. And the last thing I'll raise just in this point about crisis management is, again, when you look at the history of these other nuclear dyads, and in particular, we now have all this wonderful information about both the US and the Soviet side during the Cold War. And what is so striking about this is countries recognize imbalances, power imbalances. In particular, all through the 1950s and early 60s, the Soviets got how much more powerful we were than they were. And as a result, the moment that we got into these crises, the Soviets were also pulling back as fast as they possibly could. For those who are interested, I mean, there's just great stuff now out on the Berlin crises, on the Cuban Missile crises. We have the actual Politburo minutes from all of those crises. And it is just so striking how the Soviets, like the Iranians, recognized immediately this is a big problem. We made a very big mistake. The Americans are much stronger than we are, and we have got to pull back as fast as we can, even if that means making humiliating concessions to the Americans. And so would crisis management be a problem? Conceivably. But I'm much more nervous about crisis management between Israel and Iran, or Saudi Arabia and Iran, than I am about the US and Iran. And in fact, one of the things I think the right answer to that is it's another argument for the United States remaining engaged in the region. The more that we stay engaged, the more that we turn any of crisis between Iran and Israel or Iran and Saudi Arabia into a crisis between Iran and the United States, the greater the likelihood, in fact, the very high likelihood, that the crisis will be resolved quickly and to our advantage because of this massive imbalance. Second problem people raise, proliferation. I spent a lot of time looking at the proliferation problem. In my mind, it is a problem with one country, Saudi Arabia. Okay? And I think that there is a real reason to fear that the Saudis might decide they need nuclear weapons too, but I do not think it's a foregone conclusion. I think that there are good reasons why the Saudis have not acquired nuclear weapons. And let's remember, they backed the Pakistani nuclear program. And there's nobody who believes that the Saudis did that out of the goodness of their hearts. Okay? Everyone believes that the Saudis had some claim on the Pakistani technology or perhaps the weapons themselves. And they have never chosen to avail themselves of that. Now, maybe it's because, almost certainly it is because they're waiting for the right opportunity, the real moment when they really have a threat. But what it also speaks to is how the Saudis recognize that there are very important countervailing pressures, very important reasons not to acquire this capability. If Iran acquires a nuclear arsenal, I think the Saudis will be sorely tempted to get one themselves. But I do not think it will be a foregone conclusion. I think the United States will have lots of opportunities to weigh in with the Saudis and to hopefully convince them that they don't need to go down that path. And by the way, the Israelis also believe that that is the case. And I'm glad to talk more about that in the Q&A, but I want to wrap this up. The last issue that people talk about, and it's a good issue, it's one I think I may have at first put on the table 10, 11 years ago when I wrote Persian Puzzle, which is what I called then the Pakistan problem. The fear that once Iran gets nuclear weapons, they will become emboldened. They will become more aggressive in terms of their support for terrorism and insurgencies and subversives and other things like that. And I think that's a very real problem. And I think that there is very real reason to fear that the Iranians will be emboldened in that way, especially if the negotiations with Rouhani fail. And this empowers the hardliners to be able to say, see, we told you the Americans were never going to give us what we wanted because the Americans just want to crush us, and therefore we have to fight back as hard as we can. But again, the more that I looked into this and the more that I worked through it and did the kind of good old-fashioned military analysis, a couple of things really loomed large for me. First, I think that we can fight the Iranians much better than we have. I think both defensively, helping our allies, preventing messes from emerging from the region. I mean, let's remember what the Iranians typically do is they look for some mess in the Middle East and then they go in and make it worse. And since there are no shortage of messes in the Middle East, there's no shortage of opportunities for them. But the more that we can help prevent or heal those messes, the harder it is for the Iranians to take advantage of them. I also think there are better ways for us offensively to deal with them in terms of, if we want to, if they become more aggressive, we can become more aggressive. Covert action, cyber warfare, sanctions, there are all kinds of good ways to push back on the Iranians if they do become aggressive at this level. But the real kicker for me was that the more I looked at this, the more that I felt that, again, the Iranians will probably become more aggressive in this way. It will make the region worse, not better. But there's no reason to believe that it's going to fundamentally change anything. In the 34 years of trying, the Iranians have never overthrown a foreign government. We actually have a much better track record of overthrowing foreign governments than the Iranians. Although I think if the Iranians actually were ever to sit down with us and ask us about that experience, we might suggest to them that it actually is not all that it's cracked up to be. But the Iranians have never been able to overthrow a foreign government despite trying for 34 years. They've never started a civil war. They have never started an insurgency. The most that they can do is, as I said before, go into situations that were pre-existing, where problems preceded them, and go in and make those problems worse. And obviously that's bad, that's not good, the Middle East doesn't need any more of that. But I look at that and say, is that worth running the costs, running the risks, and paying the costs of a war with Iran? And I come down and say, no, in the net, that doesn't work for me. And I work through all of these different trade-offs, and at the end of the book, I kind of work through all the costs and risks of containment against all the costs and risks for war, and I come up and I say, in the net, I come down on favor of containment. It looks better to me. I am more willing to pay the costs and risks of containment than I am willing to pay the costs and risks of going to war. But I end the book, and I'm going to end my talk today by saying, if you read this, if you think this through, and you come to the opposite conclusion, I'm good with that. Okay? If you decide that paying the costs and risks of war are better than the costs and risks of containment, I'm good with that. Okay? What I want is to make sure that we actually have this conversation. Okay? I don't want to back into another major policy with Iran. We do that too often, not just with Iran, but with other countries, and it gets us into a lot of problems. And I don't want to get into a situation where we haven't thought this through, and so we wind up making bad decisions about things like the negotiations ongoing. I think it's critical that at this moment in time, we start to talk about these issues, we start to debate them and decide what we want to do. Because as far as I'm concerned, the worst thing that we could do with an issue that is as dangerous and as important as dealing with Iran's nuclear program is to declare that one policy or another is unthinkable. Thank you very much. Took longer than I meant to.
We have about 15 minutes for questions. The microphone will come to you. If you could just say your name and your affiliation you'd like to share. Here's the first hand that went up there.
Thank you very much. Timothy Stafford, I'm a master's student at Georgetown, the SSP program. My question is if you could comment on what steps the US would take to reassure Saudi Arabia once Iran went nuclear, because the Saudi view could be, well, you were critical of us with regard to Bahrain, you're not really helping us with regard to Syria, you let Mubarak fall, and now on top of everything else, you know, Iran's gone nuclear. I mean, what steps will be taken? Would you envisage US troops being put back into Saudi Arabia as kind of a tripwire like they were in NATO?
Yeah, this is a great question. Again, one I deal with it at some length in the book. And for me, it starts with the British Defense Minister, Dennis Healey's famous remark that it's much easier to deter adversaries than it is to reassure allies. And it is going to be very difficult to do so. And I think there are a lot of different points and steps for us to take. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'll throw out a few of them for you. One is to ask the Saudis what exactly it is that they're afraid of. Okay? The threat from Iran is truly the threat of subversion. All right? The Iranians do not have the conventional military capacity to threaten the kingdom. Yes, conceivably, if there were no U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf, they might be able to threaten Bahrain or, threaten Dubai. But the reality of the situation is that the U.S. Navy is in the Gulf, and we're not leaving. And the United States Navy, even with its current capacity in the Gulf, can deter, can defeat anything that the Iranians try. So there literally is no conventional military threat from Iran. We've also learned over the years, and I think the Iranians are full aware of it, nuclear blackmail just doesn't work. Okay? We have never seen a nuclear state go to a country and say, you give us that piece of land or else we're going to nuke you. Or, you raise the volume of your oil production or lower the price of oil or any of this. It just doesn't work. Okay? And I think, again, the Iranians are full aware of it. So the real threat, again, to the kingdom is this threat of subversion that I was just talking about. And as I said, I think there are lots of good ways to say to the Saudis, we're going to help you with that threat. But part of it is also saying to the Saudis, how exactly does acquiring your own nuclear capability help you deal with that threat? All right? Are you going to drop it on the eastern province of Saudi Arabia? Are you going to drop it on the Iranians if they don't stop shipping RPGs and Kalashnikovs and Rials to the folks in the eastern province? These are incredibly asymmetric, and one has nothing to do with the other. Now, all that said, that may not be enough. And it may be that we do have to do some other things simply to reassure the Saudis psychologically. And there my answer is we simply need to have a conversation with the Saudis about what would reassure you. And I have a section in the book that talks about the possibility of a somewhat increased American military presence. Again, there is zero need for it militarily. I mean zero need for it militarily. But you know what? If the Saudis need us to reassure them by deploying a couple of additional Air Force squadrons to Qatar or increasing the presence of a carrier, I think that is a very small price to pay. The real issue in my mind is this question of a defense treaty. I'm not convinced the Saudis would want it. And what's more, I'm absolutely convinced the Iranians don't need it. I think, if you look at the history of the United States in the Persian Gulf, especially as the Iranians do, the Iranians know full well we will defend Saudi Arabia. I don't think they're under any illusion about that. Again, it's this issue of how do you reassure an ally. And, under those circumstances, might we need to sign some kind of a treaty with the Saudis? It strikes me as possible. It would be a difficult thing to do. The Senate doesn't like passing treaties. And of course, there are a lot of Americans who are very unhappy with Saudi Arabia in lots of ways. But I'd certainly be willing to explore it. And it's all a way of saying that, are these things we may have to do? Sure. Are these apocalyptic? No way.
And if you could please just ask one question, because there's so many hands that are going up instead of, two parts to it.
Right. And if you could really ask a dumb question that I could answer with one word, that'd be even better.
Should we infer from the title of your book and your presentation, it's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group, that sanctions are never going to work? And maybe to sneak in one question, what about another one? What about non-state actors and the degree to which we might have to worry about their deterrability or containability?
Sure. Great questions, Dana. Again, both issues that I deal with in the book. I think sanctions are working. This is part of my argument about what's going on right now. This is what success looks like. Right? When I wrote Persian Puzzle back in 2003 and outlined this whole policy, if you had gone to Nick Burns, who was the guy who really pushed it during the Bush administration, or gone to Dennis Ross and the folks who brought it to President Obama, and said to any of us, okay, what would we expect success to look like? How does it? This is what it looks like. It's the Iranians coming to the table and being willing to negotiate and put things on the table that we've never seen before. That's exactly what's going on. So could sanctions work? Do I believe sanctions are working? I do not believe, though, that sanctions would bring about the collapse of the Iranian regime. Is it possible? It's possible. My reading of the economic history, and I bring that into the book too, is that's unlikely. What's more, my own experience with Iraq is that if the sanctions go on too long, I'm afraid that we're creating unsustainable sanctions. And that what we will see with Iran is what we saw with Iraq, and the international community turning against the sanctions and deciding, you know what, this is too much pain being inflicted on the Iranian people who are innocents, and we will start to see an erosion of sanctions. So I believe the sanctions have been very important. I think they have succeeded. That's how we got Rouhani. That's how we got to this point. I am dubious that sanctions are going to get us much beyond this. I think this is an incredible achievement. So it's not like I'm downplaying the sanctions. So that's point one. On your point about non-state actors, again, something I look at length in the book. And my ultimate conclusion there is it conceivable the Iranians might give nuclear weapons to a terrorist group? I guess it's conceivable. It strikes me as exceptionally unlikely. I mean, first, as a number of other people have pointed out, Paul Pillar in particular, we have never seen a country give weapons of mass destruction to a terrorist group. Second, we've never seen the Iranians do it. I mean, as I always like to point out, the Iranians have been supporting terrorism since 1979, and they've had weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological, since 1989. They have never mixed the two of them. And I think it's very clear that the Iranians recognize, first, that terrorists are always free actors, free agents. I mean, even Hezbollah, which is as close an ally as you can imagine, the Iranians, at the end of the day can do things, sometimes do things that the Iranians don't fully agree with. But everybody else, you never know what they're going to do with them. And I think that the Iranians recognize full well that if some terrorist group hits some country with weapons of mass destruction, that country isn't going to sit around waiting for proof that would stand up in a court of law. They're going to hit back as hard as possible. They will doubtless get their friends, the United States of America, to hit back as hard as possible. If the Iranians wanted to deliver a nuclear weapon clandestinely, they've got the Quds Force to do it. I don't think they're going to turn it over to Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It just makes no sense from their perspective. And again, I think that's why the history has been we've never seen this happen with lots of countries that you could theorize as doing it. Last point I'll make on that is, again, it does bring up an issue that I deal with repeatedly in the book, which is these very, very low probability, high payoff events of, well, there's some residual doubt. Shouldn't we take extreme action to deal with the residual doubt? And again, I come back to the history of the Cold War, which, there have been a lot of lessons gleaned from the history of the Cold War. But for me, the resounding lesson, the most important lesson of the Cold War was that both we and the Soviets made a fundamental mistake in concentrating enormously on this fear of the surprise nuclear attack. We both wasted billions upon billions of dollars and rubles trying to guard against this. We both created crises that didn't exist beforehand because of our fear of it, and we both greatly exacerbated crises that were pre-existing because of our fear about it. And what's so striking, now that we read the minutes from both sides, is neither country ever had any intention of launching a surprise attack against the other. But neither side could fully trust the other. And as I said, we actually reduced our own security. We made the situation much worse by chasing this. And it's why I keep coming back to again and again, the main lesson for me of the Cold War is that you have to deal with what is most likely, not the absolute worst case, or for that matter, the absolute best case scenarios, because you get yourself into a lot of trouble that way.
Thank you. My name is Cornelius Adebar. I'm with the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, but I was posted in Tehran until just after the elections of Rouhani. My question is nothing you could have written about in the book because of the positive developments of the recent weeks. What are the options if we do get a deal and it gets the nod, say, from the president and from Khamenei, but it falls apart domestically in Congress or with the Revolutionary Guards? What is if the deal is there but it doesn't stand? Thank you.
This is my nightmare. Because I just think that puts us in a horrible situation. If the Iranians are willing to sign up to the deal and we're not, oh my God, what do we do then? I mean, I think we'll wind up containing Iran, because that's what we'll keep doing. first, I'll answer that in two different ways. First, I really hope that it never comes to that. I do hope that the president is going to have the political courage to stand up and go to the Congress and say, this is a good deal, we need to take it. I worry about that, though. I've not seen this president show that kind of political courage, especially when it's come to foreign policy. I worry that President Rouhani looks across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic and wonders if he really has a partner in President Obama. I hope that that is the case. I think it would be, it put us in an enormously difficult situation. That said, if it does come to that, first, I am willing to believe that the status quo is actually more durable, at least for some period of time. Again, I'm struck by the fact that President Obama keeps saying his red line is weaponization. I think he's absolutely right about that. Again, something I talk about in the book. Something where when I started writing the book, I wasn't sure how I felt about whether there was a difference between a breakout capability and an actual arsenal. And again, as I did the analysis, I came to the conclusion, actually, there is an enormous difference between a breakout capability and an actual arsenal. So I think that, on our side, we've got the red line right. And on their side, I'm really struck by the fact that, A, the Supreme Leader keeps saying he's not going to weaponize. And by the way, I talk about the fatwa. I think the fatwa was nonsense. But I do think what's really meaningful is that the Supreme Leader keeps saying that there's a fatwa, and he would never break the fatwa. And I find that very meaningful. And I think that what he's in effect said and also indicated by his willingness to keep converting 19.75% enriched uranium into these plates for the Tehran research reactor is, I'm not going to cross your red line, America. I'm not even going to cross Bibi Netanyahu's red line. And so I think that that is the Iranian signaling in the broadest way possible. We're actually pretty good with where we are right now, and we hope you guys are good with it too. So my sincerest hope would be that if we can't get the actual deal, that we will be able to at least continue this modus vivendi. Last point I will make. The interesting question for me, and in some ways this is a question for you, is actually what do the Europeans do? If the Iranians agree to the deal and the Americans won't accept it, do the Europeans decide to unilaterally start repealing some of the EU sanctions, which obviously they could do. Now, the problem will then become that will create a fight with the United States because, of course, we have all of these secondary sanctions. And again, my hope would be that the president would at least have the political courage to start issuing waivers and to not block that. And if that's the case, then maybe we can get kind of, the next best thing to the deal, which would be the Iranians starting to do some of the right things on their own in return for the EU doing the right things on their own without the explicit American participation. Very real question.
Last question.
Hey, Diane.
Diane Perlman, Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So I'm thinking of another option that, since you finished your book, may now be thinkable, which is reconciliation with Iran and shifting, and also, parties are more dangerous than they're afraid, and there's, the law of opposites, and the more we threaten them, the more they feel a need for nuclear weapons. So issues like, tension reduction. Also, they want a face-saving way out. They want to join the world of nations. Some a colleague of mine, Dennis Sandoli, and others have discussed Iran participating in disarming Syria from chemical weapons. They made overtures to us in the early 2000s, which Bush rejected. So is that now thinkable?
Yeah. Which is a great question. And what I'd say is, I don't see that as an alternative option. For me, that's part of this option. That's part of the diplomatic option. Because my hope would be that the nuclear deal becomes the gateway to that wider reconciliation and a process of dealing with our concerns and dealing with Iran's concerns, and by the way, dealing with the concerns of the Israelis and the Saudis as well. But I think that right now, given what Rouhani has done, we've got to play the cards in front of us. I mean, I was really surprised by it. If we had done this back in June, and you would ask me, what do I think Rouhani is going to do now that he's been elected? I think I probably would have said, I suspect, he's going to go after a number of kind of smallish political and economic issues within Iran, domestic Iranian issues, as a way of racking up a few wins, creating some political capital for himself, and they'll come to the nuclear issue a little bit further down the line, once he's solidified his position within Tehran a bit better. He hasn't done that. You know, this guy, and you know, yesterday I got asked the question, well, why has he done that? And you know, I think there's a range of possible different answers to that. We don't really know why he has done this, but you know, he is right out of the gate gone after, you know, the biggest prize of all, the nuclear issue, the relationship with the United States, and the relationship with the West. This is a big gamble for him. And of course, that's what he keeps saying. I mean, he keeps saying, I don't have a lot of time, because if I don't show results to the hardliners, I'm dead. And when I'm dead, I'm dead, dead. You know, it's like hot to me. I'm not coming back. I'm not going to be able to deliver on anything. So he clearly is betting that he can get this deal with us and that that will make other things possible for him, both domestically and internationally. And given that, given this kind of high stakes risk he's taking, this gamble he's taking, it behooves us to play that out. And, you know, my feeling is if we can get the nuclear issue, God, you know, that opens up all these other possibilities. And we can go back to them and say, hey, let's have a conversation about Syria. You know, maybe we do invite them to Geneva. Hey, let's have a conversation about navigation in the Persian Gulf. Let's have a conversation about drug running through Baluchistan. I mean, there's lots of different ways to then start playing this out. And I'd love to see all of that happen. I just think that we've got to start with what Rouhani has put on the table and said, this is where I want to start. Because it's very clear that Zarif wants to do all these other things. He was pushing this, if you remember, back in 2002 and 2003, when he was negotiating with Ryan Crocker and Jim Dobbins over Afghanistan and trying to parlay that into something bigger. So I hope that that does happen. But for me, Diane, that's not another option. That's the option we got right in front of us that I hope we've got the courage to really grasp. Thank all of you very much.